Hello, my name is Chris Perry and I teach history. Today I would like to talk to you about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. This occurred on April 14th, 1865, which, if you can add, which I have trouble with sometimes, that would come out to 155 years ago this April the 14th, which at the time of this recording would be tomorrow. Now, this is a very interesting event in a lot of ways. It's not just a history geek like myself, but to anyone that enjoys American history. There's a lot of things happening here that you may or may not have known about, and it changed the entire complexity of the country in one fell swoop. This was right after the Civil War. The Civil War was coming to a close, and the leader, and by many historians consider Lincoln to be the greatest president. This is, of course, debatable. I know you've probably sat around and ranked your top 5 presidents, before bed at night. You think about, well, who's the top 5, right? Well, I normally put Lincoln up there near the top. Some people do, some people don't, but he definitely deserves our respect for what he was dealing with during his time. Now, leading up to this assassination, let's go back a month to March 4th, 1865. And this was Lincoln's second inaugural address. Now, Lincoln is one of these guys who can really, really speak. And he has some remarkable speeches, really amazing words that he had put together because unlike today, while Lincoln may have had some help from time to time with different words and different choices of words, most of the time, what you read, Lincoln wrote. In fact, he wrote the Gettysburg Address, some people believe, while he was on the train going to Gettysburg. So the Gettysburg Address is one of those speeches that I'm sure you've heard of. You may really, really enjoy. You may be able to recite. That's one. Also, another one that I like a lot, the electric cord speech. Amazing. Now, the second inaugural, however, has some of the most stirring words ever put out there. A leader in the United States toward the end of the Civil War. You're looking at 1864 here. This happened in 1865, but the election went on in 1864. This is what Lincoln said in this speech, the highlight. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in. Now, this is amazing words. They are fantastic. You can't really put into just the meaning of something like that at the time that he said it. If I was ever going to get a tattoo, which I don't have any yet, I would get that with Lincoln's head maybe on my arm. There's some amazing words. But this was his second inaugural address. There were many people there. He was standing outside in Washington giving the speech. Also, there were some interesting spectators, let's say, that were in attendance that day. This is a picture from that particular day. And up here at the top, you see Mr. Booth. Down here at the bottom, potentially, and this is up for debate, but this picture allegedly puts forward the other conspirators that were involved in what we're going to talk about going forward, the actual assassination itself. Everyone knows or has heard John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth shot the president. We know that. That's not in dispute. But what you may not know is the fact that this was a conspiracy by people who sympathized with the South and Booth in particular to basically try to cut the head off the government. And we're going to talk about that going forward. It was a conspiracy to derail the United States government. Now, how are they going to do this, you may ask? What's the point? Who's going to kill who? And why is it a conspiracy? Well, John Wilkes Booth saw this speech, right? He saw that speech. He wasn't impressed. Then a few days before the actual assassination took place, Lincoln is in public speaking about, of all things, right? African American suffrage, the vote for African Americans. And Booth, being a Southern sympathizer and just a raving racist, let's just say what it is, he did not like this at all. And he's like, oh boy, we can't let this happen. We got to kill him. Right? So this is Booth's thinking. He also recruits people with him. This has been going on for a little while. This is not just popping up in April, but they've been meeting clandestinely, of course, and they've been putting this together, and they have a plan. Now, here are some of the conspirators. All right, so the whole plan here is John Wilkes Booth was to kill Abraham Lincoln. You have Lewis Powell and David Harold. They were to kill Secretary of State William Seward. And George Atzerodt was to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson. All this was going to happen on the same night. Everything was going to happen on April 14th. That's the way it was planned. And it was basically, Booth believed he was going to be a hero when this was all said and done. Booth was, as we have mentioned, someone who sympathized with the Confederacy. He believed in their ideas, and he hated Lincoln, and he wanted to kill him. And this was the direction they were going to go. So, how did this thing go? And maybe as you're going through, you look at these conspirators and you look at, well, maybe I haven't heard about this. Some of you may have, right? But in April of 1865, why this thing comes to a head, everything's happened. We've already seen the second inaugural address. We've seen Lincoln's speech about suffrage for African Americans. And we see that there are some people that are right there with Lincoln in Washington who are Southern sympathizers who wish him harm. Now, as we look at April 1865, a lot of things are happening in April 1865. We've got Grant has chased Lee from Richmond, right? You've got Lincoln goes to Richmond. He walks on the ground in the middle of the street, right? With no fear, because the war is all but over at this point in April of 1865. And eventually, April 9th, you have the surrender at Appomattox. Lee surrenders to Grant. Now, the presidency will age a person. It will age a person very badly. You can see this today. Most recently, I've seen pictures of Barack Obama when he took office in 2008 and when he left in 2016. You could tell that the presidency had aged him. Now, of all these pictures before and after that I have seen, this one is probably the most striking. If you look at Lincoln, who did not have the beard, that came later. Actually, an interesting story about the beard. The beard only came about because Lincoln wanted to, as he put it, be less ugly. So he grew the beard. Also, he received a letter from a young lady who said he would look a lot better with the beard. So he grew the beard. Anyway, another story for another time. But as you can see, this particular time in history really aged Lincoln quite a bit. And he dealt with a lot of depression. They called it melancholy then, as you could call it that now too. And he was he dealt with a lot of depression. But on this day, the days leading up to the assassination, and also on this day in particular, there were people who said Lincoln was the happiest he'd ever been before this happened, before the actual assassination. You have James Harlan, senator, said he'd never seen Lincoln happier. And then you've got Secretary of the Treasury Hugh McCullough said Lincoln was just almost cheerful, something he hadn't seen in a very, very long time. So all this was happening at that time. But then you have the assassination itself. Now, going back to that, what happens in a nutshell? We all know Booth shoots Lincoln in the back of the head. He jumps off the balcony, breaks his leg in the meantime as he jumps, and he yells, "Sic semper tyrannis," death to tyrants, and he runs off, or tries to. He hobbles off because he's got a broke leg. They end up catching him later, and he dies in a burning barn. Very interesting story about chasing Booth down, but that's another one for another time. So what happened with the other conspirators? Were they successful? Well, Powell and Harold actually did stab Secretary of State William Seward. He was injured, but survived. George Atzerodt basically chickened out and didn't even attempt to kill Andrew Johnson. He just got drunk. But what does happen is you have this moment where everything kind of just goes crazy. And they're looking for who did it, why, we got to get him. Well, we know about Booth. So Booth is dead. He's been shot after he's been injured in a barn, right? So they have the trial, and they end up hanging the conspirators. Now, an interesting side note to this is Mary Surratt and Dr. Samuel Mudd. Now, if you've ever heard of Mary Surratt, she was kind of thrown into this because it was at her tavern where the conspirators met. And there's a lot of debate whether she had anything to do with this or not, whether or not that she did anything. But what we do know is she was convicted and she was hanged. She was the first female hanged by the federal government in United States history, Mary Surratt. Also, Dr. Samuel Mudd, he set Booth's leg as they were escaping, potentially not knowing anything about what was going on with Booth, but he set his leg. And he also was indicted for this. And his name forever lives in infamy. If you ever heard of the My Name is Mudd. You ever heard of that before? That could have originated with Dr. Samuel Mudd. Now, and the last thing, after Lincoln dies, you see the love that the country had for him. He's on a funeral train. This funeral train travels around kind of the northeast area. He's going to Illinois, it's toward the Midwest, to be buried. And the funeral train, 300,000 people see Lincoln in Philadelphia, 500,000 people see him in New York, and 200,000 see him in Chicago before he's finally buried in Springfield, Illinois. But the funeral train was an event. People lined up for miles to see this and to see Lincoln come through, because Lincoln meant so much to the people, and the people meant so much to Lincoln. Lincoln is an interesting story, and people tend to, they will really put him on a pedestal, which for what he had to deal with, you can see that. But his entire belief system, the way he looked at things, evolved over time. 1860 Lincoln was much different than 1865 Lincoln. His ideas evolved, and I think that's really what made him so great and why it was such a loss for the assassination. Because Reconstruction, which comes next, could have been much different with Lincoln in charge. It may have been a slower process, but it may not have ended with the way that it did. But that's another story for another time. But that is what happened on April 14th, 1865.